So in this video, we're going to be covering some of the basics of filing a tax return for an individual. And so some of the key topics that are going to be covered today is who must or should file, because those can be different things. What do we need to do to verify the identity of a taxpayer? How do we determine the most beneficial filing status for a taxpayer? And how do we determine who can be claimed as a dependent? And we're going to take a look at what some unique filing situations are. And we're going to go through all of this at the end in publication 4012 as well, so that you know exactly where you need to look to get some of the more detailed information, because in these videos, I'm really going to be going over a lot of high level stuff, because to be honest, these videos would be many hours long if I went into all of the intricacies here. So you should always refer back to publication 4012 for specific cases. And so to start off here, we're going to talk about who must file. So when I say who must file, this basically means people who are legally obligated to file. It is not optional for them to file a tax return. And so in order to determine if they are legally required to file a return, there are three things that we need to know. First, we need to know the age of the taxpayer, and we primarily get this from both the identification that they provide us and the intake and interview sheet. This is typically very easy to verify. Secondly, we have to look at what their gross income amount is. And it's important to understand what gross income means, because this is different than if we just said the word income. So, gross income, when we're talking about taxes, is all income that is not exempt from tax. And we typically are able to calculate this number from the tax documents that they provide us and from the intake and interview sheet. And so oftentimes the intake and interview sheet won't be a factor with regard to calculating gross income, but it would be if, for example, they had cash income from tips at a job they worked that they didn't get a tax form for. So we would add that income from the tips to the combined income from the tax documents for the sources that are not exempt from tax. And then third, and we're going to cover how to determine this later, but it's important as a tool right now, and we go over this first part, is we need to know what the taxpayer's filing status is. And again, for now, you don't need to know how to determine that. We'll talk about that in a little bit here, but you still have to know it in order to determine if they are legally required to file. And so I put this chart in the slides here because it's one of the most important charts that we have in all of VITA. And so basically, this tells you, for the most part, whether someone has to file or not. It doesn't tell you for everyone. Note there it says Chart A for most people who must file, but I would say the vast majority of clients will fall under this. And as you can see here in the left-hand column, there is the filing status for the taxpayer, which is why it's important that we need that. And then also the age is in the middle column there, which we talked about on the last slide as well. And then the gross income. So you take those three factors in totality, you can come up with whether or not they are required to file. So for example here, if you file under head of household filing status and you are 40 years old and you make $15,000, you are not legally required to file a return. The inverse, say, if they were filing under head of household filing status, they were age 70, and they made $25,000 in the year, then they would in fact be required to file. So again, this chart, very important. Refer back to it when you are determining whether or not they need to file a return. And so we're going to talk about some more examples here, looking at this chart, because you'll need it for pretty much every single return. And so here, for example 1, we have a taxpayer is 23, has a filing status of single, and makes $25,000 in the year. Do they need to file a return? Yes, because again, if we go here to the chart, we say they have a single filing status, they are under the age of 65, and they made more than $12,550 in the year. So yes, they do in fact need to file. For example 2 here, we have a taxpayer who is 35 and is married to another taxpayer who is 36, and they are filing a joint return together, and their combined gross income is $25,000. Do they need to file a return? So if we come here again, look here, they are under married filing jointly. They are both under 65 and their income is below $25,100. Just by a little bit, but it is below it. So do they need to file a return? No, they do not. Because again, they are under that income threshold based on their filing status and the age that they both fall under. So again, it's not rocket science. Figure out if they need to file or not. Just use the chart and that will give you the answer most of the time. But again, don't always refer to the chart. Be sure to pay attention down here to notes and different exceptions here. And that's an important note in general when we talk about these rules, especially in these slides. I'm going to be pretty general because again, it would just take me forever if I went into detail on everything, and that would take me a long time to record, and you probably don't want to sit through a 6-hour video. And so when you're actually doing a return, be sure to read these notes down here and make sure no exceptions apply. So some special situations where a taxpayer is required to file a return. So again, this goes back to that chart where it said for most individuals, this is going to tell you whether or not they need to file. But again, you should always refer back to publication 4012. That is going to be a common theme, especially in the next video when I start talking about income. But some examples of when a taxpayer would be required to file a return, even though they would not potentially be so under the chart that we just looked at, is when a taxpayer is self-employed and they have net earnings of $400 or more, a taxpayer who owes special taxes, and that is very, very vague, but there are a lot of different special taxes they could owe. And so again, you just need to refer to publication 4012 for that, or taxpayers who received advance premium tax credit advance payments. So if any of those three situations apply, even if they do not have to file under this chart here, they still would be required to file a return. So be on the lookout for that and make sure again to be paying attention to those exceptions and stay cognizant of that. Again, always use publication 4012. It will give you the answers that you need. And so now for the second part here is who should file a tax return. And this is really important here. This is one that a lot of people do not understand. Is that oftentimes, even though a taxpayer does not have to file a return, it may in fact be beneficial for them to do so. And one of the main reasons for this is that often the only way to receive specific benefits is through filing a tax return. If you are not sure, if a client comes in and they are not sure whether or not they should file a tax return and they're not legally obligated to, you can actually start a return and we can determine whether or not it will be beneficial for them before we file that return. Because again, they're not legally required to file it. So if they look at it and they say, oh, this isn't going to help me, we don't have to file it so long as that they are not legally required to. So you can always start it, see how it's going, and take it from there. And so here are some common situations when someone should file. And this is kind of what I was talking about earlier on the last slide, where oftentimes you need to file a return to get certain benefits back. So probably the most common one is to get a refund of withheld taxes, but there are the really important ones here that we'll talk more about in future videos, such as the earned income credit, the child tax credit, premium tax credit, the health coverage tax credit, which is out of scope. We can't do that. I'm not really sure why that was recorded on the list from the IRS here, or the American Opportunity Credit. We're going to see some of those this year. Recovery rebate credit. We're going to see a lot of those with COVID. The child and dependent care credit, the sick leave or family leave credit for self-employed individuals. So those are some situations you need to be on the lookout for. And again, they need to file a return to get the benefits of these. And so oftentimes it is beneficial to file a return, even though they are not legally required to do so. And so it's pretty quick there, that lesson on whether or not they should file. Basically, the overall takeaway that you should have from that is that if you're not sure and they're not sure whether or not they should file, you should start a return and see how it's going and check that list and see if there are situations that apply to them where you think it would be beneficial. And so moving on now, we're going to talk about how do we actually go about verifying the identity of a taxpayer. We've talked about this in some of the previous videos already, so some of this will be a little repetitive. But we have to use government-issued identification to verify that the information on the intake and interview sheet is correct, because the taxpayer is going to fill out the intake and interview sheet, and then we are going to go ahead and use their identification to verify that that is in fact correct. And an important note here is that every taxpayer needs to have a tax identification number, which I'm just going to refer to as a TIN, which is basically just an ID number that every taxpayer will have. And importantly, there are three kinds of taxpayer identification numbers. First, and the most common one that we will see, is the Social Security number. Secondly, we will see the individual taxpayer identification number, which is often shortened to ITIN. And then third, we could see an adoption taxpayer identification number, which is often abbreviated to an ATIN. And so I think we all know what a social security number is for the most part, so I'm going to go ahead and skip over that and go straight to what is an ITIN. So basically what an ITIN is that it's issued to those who are required to have a taxpayer identification number, but they're not eligible for a social security number. So this could be for a whole host of reasons, but basically it acts almost as a substitute for the social security number here, and it's given to individuals who are not eligible for that SSN. And oftentimes you can tell it's an ITIN because they begin with the number 9 and they are formatted similar to how a traditional social security number is. So again, ITIN, you're going to treat it like a social security number on the returns for the most part, and it's important that it is always entered correctly. So an ATIN, we don't see these very often. I don't think in any returns that I've done in the past or reviewed that I ever saw an ATIN, but it is something to be aware of. It's basically issued when an adoption is in the process of being completed, because oftentimes when parents are in the process of adopting a child, they can go ahead and take advantage of some tax benefits that would typically be allotted to parents, even though the adoption is not completed at that time. And so an ATIN, it serves much the same purpose as an ITIN, but it's issued in the case when an adoption is in the process of being completed. And so a question that probably comes up is, what do we do if a taxpayer does not have any form of taxpayer identification number? So they don't have a social security number, they don't have an ITIN, and they don't have an ATIN. So the first option we have is that if they do not have a taxpayer identification number, we can direct them to the Social Security Administration and recommend that they fill out an application for a social security number. But if they are not eligible for a social security number, we will direct them to the IRS and have them fill out an application for an ITIN, because again, an ITIN is for individuals who are not eligible for a social security number, so that is what we would refer them to. And this does not mean that we have to stop doing the return, and we can use a temporary identification number, and there are instructions under tab L of the publication 4012 to explain how to do this and how to enter it into the tax software. We cannot file these returns electronically, so it is even more important to follow the steps correctly. And so if you get into a scenario when we're actually operating the site and a taxpayer does not have a TIN and we need to use a temporary identification number on the return, use the instructions in tab L of the publication 4012, and I would highly recommend seeking the help of a more experienced volunteer or one of the coordinators if you have the chance. And so, how to file a return. So the taxpayer is going to tell us whether or not they would like to e-file the return or have a mail file return. In reality though, basically every single return we do, maybe we did do one or two mails, but for the most part we do e-files. I'd say 99% of taxpayers will choose to have their return e-filed, and in reality that's something that's more for the site coordinator to worry about, so I would not stress about that a ton. It's just important to know most people are going to e-file their return, and when we get to the tax layer tutorial, I'm going to show you where, when you're actually preparing a return, you just go ahead and mark that they want to e-file it. It's not rocket science, but it's important that it is done right on each return. And so moving on here to the second main topic in this lecture is going to be around filing statuses. So far we've learned basically whether they should file, whether they have to file, and then how do we verify their identity. So now we're going to talk about how do we actually determine what their filing status is. So the way that I commonly think of a filing status is that it is basically a category that a taxpayer uses to identify their life situation. So for example, if you're filing under the single filing status, you're saying, I am a single person. If you're filing under married filing jointly, you're saying, I am married and my spouse and I would like to file a return jointly. And so you see when we talk about the other filing statuses as well, that think about it as a category that a taxpayer uses to identify their life situation really does, I think, fit, because really that's what the filing status is meant to convey. It's meant to convey what the life situation of the taxpayer is. And so there are 5 filing statuses that a taxpayer can choose from. And so listed in the order of most beneficial in general, this is not always the case, but I would say most often, and the IRS would agree, because this is a list straight from the IRS, is that the most beneficial in general is married filing jointly, with the second most beneficial being qualifying widow or widower, the third most beneficial being head of household, the fourth being the single filing status, and the fifth being married filing separately. I would say in our case, the most common filing statuses that we are going to see is single, obviously, is probably going to be the most prominent one, especially being on a college campus. I would say married filing jointly and head of household are pretty close to each other, but those would be the 2 other ones that we would most often see. So our 3 main ones are probably most often in returns going to be single, married filing jointly, head of household. So how does marital status impact filing status? Well, it's very important to know what the taxpayer's marital status is. And the most important detail is whether or not they were married on the last day of the year. This will usually tell us whether or not they can be considered married for their determination of their filing status. But there are some exceptions to the last day of the year rule. So first is if they are legally separated under a divorce or maintenance decree, or if the spouse died during the year and they have not remarried. So looking at those 2 exceptions, if they're separated under a divorce decree or maintenance decree, but they're not officially divorced, they would be considered unmarried at the end of the year. And then for the second exception, if the spouse died during the year and they have not remarried, they would be considered married for that year. So again, going back to what I was talking about with the chart when we looked at whether or not someone has to file or not, there's going to be a lot of charts that you see in publication 4012, and they're very helpful, but it's also very important to pay attention to the exceptions that are often printed underneath them, such as this one. And so now we're going to go through what each of the 5 filing statuses are. And so first here is single, and it is basically what it sounds like. The taxpayer is not married, and it's pretty simple, straightforward filing status. But important thing to be on the lookout for is that someone who thinks they should file under single can sometimes qualify for head of household status. And so that is something we'll talk about more in a little bit, but be on the lookout for the potential for them to qualify as head of household. And so married filing jointly is our next status we already talked about, and that is when a married couple use a joint return to report all of their income and expenses. So they'll combine all of their income and expenses onto one shared return. And then it's important here to check publication 4012 for some rare and specific situations where taxpayers can file jointly even if they are not married. And in reality, this pretty much never comes up for us, but it's an important note here, and that's a nice typo by me where I wrote, we really never see this sum up. That should have been come up. But okay. And yeah, we don't really ever see this happen, and so it's important to be aware of, but I would not stress over it too much. Married filing jointly is usually pretty straightforward. So married filing separately, this is one that you sometimes see people come in thinking that they want to do it, and then they realize they actually do not want to do it. And so what married filing separately is it's when a married couple chooses to not file a joint return together. And we generally do not recommend this, and you should be very careful when a taxpayer would like to file married filing separately, and we need to make sure they understand this filing status before they select it. So there are many reasons why we do not want for them often to file under married filing separately, and because it generally results in a higher tax because they can't take advantage of a lot of benefits afforded to either single head of household or married filing jointly taxpayers. It occasionally can save them money, but for the most part, I very seldom ever have seen where married filing separately in real life benefits a taxpayer that comes into one of our clinics. So be very cognizant when someone wants to file under this status. And so, head of household, this is one that is really important to understand, and we're going to spend some time talking about it because this is one that oftentimes people don't think that they qualify for, but in reality they do, and it can be a huge benefit for them. So, some of the criteria to file under the head of household filing status is that the taxpayer is unmarried or they are considered unmarried at the end of the year. They paid over half the cost of keeping up their home, and they had a qualified person living in their home for over half the year, excluding temporary absences. When it says temporary absences, basically what that means is like if a kid goes off to college, that's considered a temporary absence, so that wouldn't be counted against them as far as like living with them for that year. So if a qualified person is a college student and they lived at college for 8 months of the year away from the person who's trying to file under head of household, they would be considered as having lived with that person for all 12 months because that's a temporary absence. And head of household, if you've met those standards there, it provides a higher standard deduction and generally a lower tax rate. And there are more specifics on this in publication 4012. Oh, that's good. There's another typo in there. Who did the editing on this slides? No, that was me. So, yeah, excuse my typos there in the slides. And so, now important thing is I just threw out the word qualifying person there for head of household filing status, and you're probably like, what does that mean? And so basically, there are a few criteria that we often see when we're looking at who is a qualifying person for head of household status. So the first one is it's a qualifying child who is single. Second one is it's a married child who can be claimed as a dependent. Third, it is a dependent parent. Or fourth, it is a qualifying relative who lived with the taxpayer for more than half the year and is one of the relatives listed in publication 4012 and can be claimed as a dependent by the taxpayer. So when I walk through publication 4012 where we find all the information, you'll be able to see that there. I know it's an extremely vague description on that last bullet. And we'll go through what it means to figure out whether someone is a qualifying child or a dependent in the later parts of this slideshow, and I'll show you where in publication 4012 as well. So I know it's a little vague. We'll come back and give it some more details in a little bit. So qualifying widow and widower is one of our other filing statuses, and I would say this is the one that most people have the least information about because I don't feel like it's as well known. And if the taxpayer's spouse died in the last 2 years and they did not remarry and they pay over half of the support for a child that lived with them for the year except for temporary absences, you should check if they meet all of the standards for this filing status because again, it can give you a lot of benefits similar to what head of household would give, even though they are technically not married or may not qualify traditionally under that status. And again, publication 4012 tab B has more info there. We don't see qualifying widower as much. I'd say occasionally we will see it, and if someone comes in and they fall under that criteria, go straight to publication 4012 tab B. That will tell you the information you need to know if they can file under that status. And so one thing that I really like in publication 4012 that is a chart that I wanted to throw in here is the decision tree, and we'll show where to find this in publication 4012 later. But just to walk through the process of it, oftentimes when I'm doing an interview, I just straight up ask them these questions. I will literally just ask, were you married on the last day of the year? They say no. I'll say, did your spouse die during the year? If they say no, I'll ask them literally all of those, and if they say yes, then they'll be under qualifying widow or widower. If they say no again, I will go and I will ask them those questions, and based on their responses, that's going to tell me what their filing status is. So I would honestly recommend, for the most part, you do the same thing when determining your filing status. Just ask them the questions and let their answers take you to the appropriate filing status. Also, be sure to make note here of these tiny little numbers. Those are exceptions. Again, the exceptions are always important, and yeah, you always need to pay attention to those. So now, for the final part of these slides, we're going to talk about who actually qualifies to be a dependent. And so that's probably a term that you've heard thrown around a lot. And the definition that the IRS gives does not help to demystify this. Their definition is a dependent is a qualifying child or a qualifying relative of the taxpayer. Okay, that probably is not the most helpful for everyone if you do not know what a qualifying child or a qualifying relative is. And so, in normal people language, a dependent is basically someone who the taxpayer supports, and they additionally meet the IRS standards for them to be claimed as a dependent. So it's kind of a two-pronged definition. The way I think about it is that it's someone who the taxpayer supports, but it's also someone who fits in the specific box for them to be claimed as a dependent on their tax return. And so we're going to talk about some of those standards. And so there are a few useful resources, though, for dependents. Publication 4012, tab C. We're going to walk through that here at the end of this video as well. But it is a valuable resource for you to take a look at. And there are some specific tests to determine whether an individual can be considered a qualifying relative or a qualifying child. They have to be a qualifying relative or a qualifying child to be a dependent. And again, I'm going to hammer this point home in all of our videos. Use your resources. Do not try to memorize this. Learn the general concepts, and that's really how these videos are designed. As you can probably tell, I'm not going into a ton of detail on each of these. My goal is to give you the information that you need to be able to effectively use your resources to prepare accurate returns. And so same thing for dependents. Use your resources. Do not try to memorize all of this. And so basically, in order for someone to be claimed as a dependent, as the IRS definition states, they have to meet the criteria to be considered a qualifying child or a qualifying relative. So again, you can probably decipher there what some of the main differences between a qualifying child and a qualifying relative would be. For example, most often if a parent is going to try to claim their young child as a dependent, they're going to try to claim them under the qualifying child standard. And for example, if they are trying to claim a parent as a dependent on their return, they're obviously going to try to claim them as a qualifying relative. So while there are separate tests to determine whether they're a qualifying child or a qualifying relative, there also are some that are shared. So the first one is the dependent taxpayer test. And this says if the taxpayer or their spouse, if they are married filing jointly, can be claimed as a dependent, they cannot claim any dependents. And so basically what this means is that if the individual who is trying to claim a dependent can themselves be claimed as a dependent, they are not allowed to claim any dependents. And so secondly, the joint return test. So a married person who files a joint return cannot be claimed as a dependent unless that joint return is filed only to claim a refund of withheld income tax or estimated tax paid. So it's important to keep the second part of that definition in mind, because again, just because a married person is filing a joint return does not mean absolutely 100% they cannot be claimed as a dependent. You just have to make sure that that joint return they filed is only to claim a refund of withheld income tax or estimated tax paid. And then the third shared test is the citizen or resident test, and that says to be claimed as a dependent, a person must be a U.S. citizen, U.S. resident alien, U.S. national, or a resident of Canada or Mexico. And so moving on here to the test to be a qualifying child, and it's important the order that I put them in here because you always go through the tests for someone to be a qualifying child before you go through the tests for them to be a qualifying relative. And so the first specific test to being a qualifying child, so this is assuming that they've met all three of these tests here that are shared, is the relationship test. So the individual must have a specific relationship to the taxpayer, and there are details for this in publication 4012. We'll go over that as well. And that's similar to the head of household filing status. There's a little difference there, but it would just be very cumbersome to write them all in the slides. And so the age test here, and this is an important one to pay attention to, is that they must be under the age of 19 and younger than the taxpayer, or they must be a full-time student for at least 5 months and under the age of 24, or they can be any age if they are totally or permanently disabled. And so those are the general age buckets based on the life factor criteria that we would see a qualifying child need to fall within. And so there are a few more tests to be a qualifying child. So the first is the residency test. They must live with the taxpayer for more than half the year. As we've talked about, temporary absences, such as living at college, count as time living with the taxpayer. So secondly is the support test. The child cannot provide more than half of their own support throughout the year. And sometimes a child can be claimed by multiple taxpayers. If they can be, consult the tiebreaker rules in publication 4012. And so moving on to the qualifying relative tests. So the first one is that they are not a qualifying child test. And so this is kind of what I touched on already, where we always do the qualifying child test before we do the qualifying relative test, is that if the person is a qualifying child of a taxpayer, they cannot be a qualifying relative. So there is an exception for this if the individual who can claim them does not have to file and doesn't, or only files to get a refund of income tax withheld or estimated tax paid. So a little exception there, but in general, if the person is a qualifying child of a taxpayer, they cannot be a qualifying relative. And then the second test is the member of household or relationship test. They must be a member of the home all year or have a specific relationship to the taxpayer. So the other test specific to being a qualifying relative is the gross income tax test. And so the individual's gross income must be less than $4,300 in order for them to be claimed as a qualifying relative. The support test, the taxpayer must have provided 50% of the individual's support. And so notice here, though, where for this support test, this is slightly different than the support test for being a qualifying child. So under this one, the taxpayer who is claiming them as a dependent has to provide over or at least 50% of the individual's support. If we go back here to the test of being a qualifying child, it says that the child cannot provide more than half of their own support throughout the year. It does not say that the taxpayer trying to claim them has to be the one who provided over half of their own support. So that's a little wrinkle there to pay attention to. And so we'll go over this more in the publication 4012 walkthrough, but again, this is a helpful kind of script and map that will help tell you whether someone is probably going to be a qualifying child or a qualifying relative. And there are more pages than this. It's not just that one. But you see, I mean, you go through here, you can literally read it off. Just ask them the question. Whatever their response is, that tells you where you go for the next step. If you follow this, you should be able to figure out very well whether or not they are, in fact, a dependent. And child of divorced parents, we're going to use publication 4012. C6 is going to be the page for that, and we'll walk through that as we move on to the publication 4012 walkthrough. And we are going to go ahead and do that walkthrough now. Okay, so we are back here, and we are going to walk through publication 4012 in regard to some of our basic filing stuff that we've talked about. And so starting off here, we're going to go through tab A first, which talks about who must file, and then gives a little overview who should file. Tab B, starting a return and filing status, and then tab C, dependents here. And so we're going to go ahead and just click on tab A, and it will take us here. And so we already looked at this earlier in the slides, but this chart right here basically just shows us who is legally obligated to file, and we went over this, so I won't spend too much time on it, but you're going to use this one all the time, so be sure to know that that is there. Chart B, this is for children and other dependents, and so we're going to use this if they can be claimed as a dependent. And so we'll often see this with college students. You actually use this one a decent amount as well, because if someone can be claimed as a dependent, we can't have them using the traditional chart for determining whether or not they have to file. So you would use this one here. And moving on to it here, other situations when you must file. And so this is where I got some of the stuff from the examples that I talked about in the slides of when someone has to file. So here where I talked about some of the special taxes, here are some of the ones where they would in fact have to file. So be on the lookout for those. And then there are some other life situations when they in fact would have to file. So who should file? We talked about this as well during the slides, but this gives you a more complete list here where it goes over some of the different situations when it would be beneficial for someone to file, even though they are in fact not legally required to. And so moving on to tab B here, it's going to talk about starting a return and filing status. And so here, this is basically just walking you through what each of the tabs means in the 4012 as far as where it shows up on Form 1040, which is what the printed out tax return is. So as you'll see, that just continues through here. This just talks about some of the different schedules that we have to use depending on the different life situations of the taxpayers. And so here we talked about this already in one of the previous videos, and this is kind of a busy photo of it, but it's still a good resource here. This goes over the intake interview and quality review sheet in case you ever forget exactly what goes on it or what the different parts mean. You can refer back to here to make sure that you can get that information. So here it's just going through more of the intake interview sheet. This is page 2 here. So we're talking about here a lot of different income and expenses and life event stuffs that they have. And then here we're looking at page 3 where there is some more life event stuff and also some choices and identification information for each of the individual taxpayers. And so here, this is something that's important to keep in mind when you're doing the returns. If you ever forget what you need to do, it tells you in publication 4012 what you need to do here. So like here, it's talking about starting a new return. This is actually filling it out in TaxSlayer. Shows you how you're supposed to enter the social security number of the taxpayer. This talks about pulling prior year data if we have this information saved. I would say for most taxpayers, we will not, but we may occasionally. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. And then here, this is the filing status tree that we talked about during the slides. And so again, I would use this honestly for every return that you do. I mean, I would just ask them these questions and let their answers guide you. And so here, pay attention here, one important note here, and this goes for everything again. I know I keep hammering this, but read the footnotes because these can be important. And so it's critical you pay attention to those. And so here are some interview tips. I don't typically use this one as much. You could use this. This may be easier for you if you just want to read more of a straight up script than this one, where you kind of got to make up some of your own wording and sentences so you're not getting super robotic with it. But this one down here is going to give you a bit more of a script here as far as figuring out what their filing status is, but it's really going to be a lot of the same information as this one. And I in general prefer the first one a little bit. Yeah, and so here, this we talk about this a little bit in the slides here. And it's important to know that a qualifying person for a head of household status is separate from someone that can be claimed as a dependent. And so if you're trying to see if someone can file under head of household status, you need to use this chart. Because as you'll see here, there are different standards per se. So you can say here, if the person's qualifying child, we have to know what, for example, some of their filing information is. And then that will help us determine whether or not that person can in fact be claimed for the head of household status. And importantly here, like it says on here, don't use this chart alone. So use as directed by interview tips on the previous page, but this chart is going to be one who can help you figure out whether the person in fact qualifies to file under head of household status. And so this is where we're talking about the cost of keeping up a home. That's important for something with head of household status. And this is where you can total up some of those, and this will help serve as a guide in a way for when you're doing the calculation if they're not sure whether or not they provide enough costs of keeping up the home. And so the really important thing here, I think, is actually this note in a lot of ways at the bottom here, where we talk about costs that you can include and costs that you don't, in fact, want to include. And so here it talks about entering basic information into TaxSlayer. And so again, filing status, it's pretty simple to enter when you get into TaxSlayer. You just click the button for the most part, and it will take you through some other steps. But again, the second screen here is titled Married Filing Separate, and it is used to determine the spouse's return status. So determining the last name of the taxpayer, this is what we talked about already, a lot of it. And again, just check the identification, make sure it matches the intake interview sheet. So again, more information in there about that. More information here, entering basic info into TaxSlayer. Again, none of this is rocket science really here. We're copying names, social security numbers, dates of births, entering their occupation. You'll have that from the intake interview sheet. And then a lot of this here will also come from the intake interview sheet as well, and you'll just have to make sure that that gets conveyed accurately on the return on TaxSlayer. And so again here, I mean, it's just entering in basic information pretty much. You're getting a lot of this from the ID in the intake and interview sheet. And so then some of the steps here in TaxSlayer, and we'll go through all of this as well, but it's just important to remember that it's here in the book. This is going to tell you how you can enter dependents or qualifying persons. You got to enter information with them. It's really not too bad. The hardest part is determining whether or not they can be considered a dependent or qualifying person, not actually entering the info. And so that leads us nicely into tab C here, which goes over dependents. And so here, these are some rules for claiming a dependent, and as you'll see, these are the same rules that I just talked about in the slides, but here they are in chart form. That's going to be easier for you to refer back to when you're actually preparing returns. And so this is what I talked about at the end of the slides. They can be claimed by more than one person potentially. There are some tiebreaker rules. And so I didn't want to put these on the slides, I think for obvious reasons, looking at them. And you need to, if you're told that the qualifying child can be claimed by more than one person, you need to go through these rules. And when you go through these rules here, that will tell you who in fact is able to claim the child. So here, we already talked about this table right here. This refers to all dependents. And again, it's kind of the interview thing I was talking about earlier. You can ask these questions and it will guide you on what the answer is to whether that person be claimed as a dependent. So table 2 here, this is for if someone cannot be claimed as a qualifying child and you're trying to see if they can be claimed as a qualifying relative. These are the questions that you would ask the taxpayer. And again, just let their answers guide you. And so here, again, that's just table 2 continued and some more information there to ask the taxpayer for. And again, just helping us get to the answer. So table 3, touched on this in the slides too as well. Children of divorced or separated parents or parents who live apart. We're going to need to figure out who can actually claim the taxpayer. And so what you're going to do is you're going to ask these questions. And again, just let their answers take you to what the correct answer is. And you should be good to go. But know that you can use that if you're trying to figure out if a dependent can be claimed by a taxpayer and they are a child of divorced parents or parents who live apart. So here's a worksheet for determining support. And again, I think the most helpful thing here is that it gives you some examples of what can be considered when determining whether or not an expense counts for support. So here it gives you some examples too of items that aren't included in total supports. Those are important to keep cognizant of as well. Yeah, and so with that gives us our first 3 tabs in the publication 4012. And so hopefully you can maneuver that, because for the advanced exam and for accurately doing tests, you're going to have to go beyond a little bit what I'm doing in these slides, because they like to try to get you sometimes with some tricky questions. And so I just can't cover it all here. And so it's important that you use Publication 412 and know how to navigate it to accurately prepare returns and pass the exam. So thank you for watching. And as always, let me know if you have any questions.